Welcome to the fourth webcast of our series titled Emotional Wellbeing During the COVID-19 Crisis for Healthcare Providers. This week's topic is Supporting Our Youth, How to Survive and Thrive. I will now turn it over to our host, Dr. Alyssa Epple.
Welcome back. It's great to have this time with you. Now here we are in late April. Time, the subjective sense of time is very interesting and different. I would love to know what it's like for you. For me, it's both fast and slow. So today we are focusing on home now and family and relationships. But before we do that, we're going to return to our theme of how can we provide creative ways to support our healthcare providers, our institutions. Last week we heard a phenomenal example from New York Presbyterian Hospital from Jennifer Dorn. During a surge, during a crisis, during a disaster, it's critical to provide immediate and short-term support. And so she is leading caring circles, which are really contemplative groups where people are sharing very emotional experiences and then sharing silence. So it's not an advice-giving circle with discussion. It's a different model. It's very powerful. And she has found that this reduces the long-term consequences of these intense experiences in the hospital. So today we're going to hear about a different model. And I would like to hear from you about models that you're using in your clinics or hospitals or institutions to provide support at this time. We're going to hear from a frontline provider, virtual provider, so maybe frontline once removed. And I'm really happy to bring you Dr. Margot Pumar. She's an assistant clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry at UCSF. And part of her job has always been supporting providers, developing curriculum and psychological support to our physicians, nurses, etc. What she has developed at UCSF has been remarkable. In a very short period when this started, she created a town hall format. So while the circle of sharing is an intimate format with 10 people, the town hall can accommodate 100 providers for different divisions or clinical groups. And naturally, she has targeted those in most need right now: anesthesia, primary care, respiratory. So I'll let her talk about these well-being town halls. Welcome, Margot. Thank you so much for joining us. So what is a well-being town hall on Zoom, and how do you structure it?
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here so much with you, Alyssa, and with everyone. So they started quite organically, kind of developed out of my initial relationship with primary care, and really just looking to bring a very large group together and find ways to connect on many common experiences. And the kind of structure that we developed for that, we've just continued to iterate for the other town halls, which is basically, our goal is to create a space where we can experience how we really are going through this together and sharing our experiences. And so the format is pretty simple. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. The first thing we do is we talk about all the things that that people are going through currently, the various stresses that kind of are, the onslaught of the daily changes and the concerns and the risks. And then we then go on to talk about all of the emotional experiences that happen as well. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble sharing my screen. There we go. And so,
so we don't see it yet.
Oh.
Why don't you tell us about the 2 slides you show at the beginning?
Yeah, there you go.
Ah, okay, great.
Apologies. So yeah, so the first one is this slide, which is looking at all the kind of various things that we struggle with. And people always say, oh my gosh, this just really stresses me out. And I'm like, that's because these are all the things that are coming at us on a daily basis. And very similar for the emotions that we experience many times over the course of a day, the uncertainty, the fear, the grief, the guilt, the exhaustion, the sadness. And I use these slides really as an opportunity just to sort of acknowledge how extreme our experience and how intense our experiences are right now. And then I ask our panelists to share really what their challenges have been like. And while they do that, we ask the folks who are also, in the audience to share in the chat box. And it's generally quite moving what they're sharing. People share, that they have an immunocompromised status and what it's like to be that in the middle of COVID. We had someone who talked about that they are currently on medication for their anxiety and they needed to get their medication increased because it's just, there's so much going on. Things like not being able to turn off their thoughts, the agony of not being able to be near their elderly parents. We had someone very touchingly talk about living through the stigma of the HIV epidemic and kind of feeling it all over again, watching people now who are stigmatized if they've been COVID positive. People talk about the things that they miss, hugs, meals, birthdays, weddings, simple things like just taking their kids to the park. And then for their kids, they're trying to explain what's happening and not wanting to scare their kids, but also, trying to deal with this, talking about their kids now are scared of germs. What is that going to be like for life for them? And then also just like feeling useless or guilty. And, most recently, the kind of up and down, what's going to happen? Are things going to open up or not? And then from there, we really move into a time of sharing what has been helpful, like what is getting you through this? Even to the point of, not just how are you getting through this, but for some people, how is this bringing out the best in you? Or, what is the amazing silver lining that you didn't expect to see? In our very first one, it was right at the beginning, someone put in the chat box, I don't know if they're doing this in San Francisco, but they're howling in Oakland. And every night it brings me to tears and warms my heart with this new sense of community. People talking about doing virtual dance classes, relearning new structure, but then finding joy in their new way of structuring their life, enjoying the opportunity to have more time with family than they had before. People spontaneously reaching out to people who are even more deeply on the front lines, like the anesthesia, COVID intubation team, and then people on the chat box just like saying, thank you so much for what you're doing. People talked about that they stopped reading the news, and that was just a complete game changer for them. And one person kind of ended theirs by saying, just thank you for this. This has been a soul-filling experience. And I think for me, each of the town halls has been a gift for me personally. It's been like group therapy on, with 80 to 100 people.
Yeah, one thing you've said is that the felt sense of cohesion by these group sharings, even though they're text just flooding in and the emotion behind them has been one of the most meaningful experiences. And I think that the proof is in the pudding that there's a high demand for more of these. You're now going to give one to our own department. It's important to think of this, healing the healer, that clinicians, whether they're health or psychological, are also vulnerable people. And, our new model of medical care has to take that into account. We can't go on with this, invulnerable veneer that leads to burnout and lack of support. So I want to ask you a second question. Margot. This has been a pleasure to get to know you. We've been in the same department for many years. We only met last month when we had similar goals through our department trying to organize support. And you've been a big leader. You've been phenomenally busy. You are working incredible days in your leadership role. And so I was quite stunned to also find out that you have 2 young children at home that you're supposed to be homeschooling. It's been, you have a husband who's a provider who's out there exposed every day. And you are, you're doing a phenomenal job. So my question is, how are you doing all these roles at home in one place?
2 big things. The first thing is I accept help.
What does that mean?
People said, can we bring you meals? And I said, yes. People said, can I bring you like multiple meals each week? And I said, absolutely. And I think that really ties into my second thing, which is gratitude. I think I spend a lot of time in the moment in gratitude. I feel like that is the thing that really grounds me, because I think like when I get that meal, oh, that's half an hour I get with my kids. They were at San Francisco Parks and Recs all day at emergency childcare, and we still have all their homework to do from distance learning. And here's 30 minutes I can just spend with them, which I think is most important and grounding for me. Yeah, I think for a lot of people, gratitude has been really huge. And I find myself being really grateful for very, very simple things, from a sunny day to, this experience has been intense, but then I've got to do work like things that I've got to do with you and Dr. Mangarian and Dr. Jackson Trish in our department. And for me, I think I'll look back and think that those were really defining changes for me as a person, prioritizing things. But
Thank you, Margot.
Work.
You are absolutely one of my heroes right now, and I'm just so grateful for the work you do every day. And it takes a village, and you have somehow managed to find a village so that life goes on for your kids, for your husband and you in your important professional roles right now. So I want to dedicate the rest of the session to parents, to all the parents out there who last month found out that hopefully, well, if they still were lucky to have work, their work is now at home, their kids are now at home, their new role is being a teacher for homeschooling. For this, this is to all the single parents. And I think everyone is in such a phenomenally challenged role right now that, the title Thrive and Survive, we really mean survive. And, what can thriving within survival at this time look like? So thank you for your beautiful example. And I hope, I look forward to, as this evolves, having these models disseminated. And as I said, I hope to hear from other of you that we can feature your own local models of how to provide institutional and group support, not just individual. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so I won't cry as I introduce our speaker, Dan Siegel, but I will say that Dan and I teach together really about burnout and caregivers and stress resilience, but today we're focusing on family and relationships and parenting. And this book, The Whole Brain Child, was a phenomenal strength to me when my child was young, many, many years ago. The book is a little bit yellowed, but it's still got phenomenal principles in it. And I have a special needs child. Homework was an incredible challenge. It didn't happen a lot until there's just a couple principles from that book that I'll just say. Dan is an expert at let's just say acronyms and epithets that have, that if you can remember them and do them in the moment, they truly help. So one is connect and redirect. So if you are needing to do homework with your child, you don't sit down in an achievement mentality and try to be productive and use time well, but rather connect. Nothing happens before you connect your empathy, your emotional life to your child's. And once that happens, maybe you can then start talking about homework and intellectual things. And the other is Name It to Tame It, which is, you know, a phenomenal concept that is at the core of all of our self-regulation, not just our children's. So welcome, Dan. I'd love to see you.
There we go. Thank you, Alyssa. Thanks for having me. And
so what I would love to hear from you first. I think we're going to spend a lot of our time about practical child family questions. We got great questions from our audience. And I first want to give you a chance to give us some background. So in the, I told you about the whole brain child, and it's based on interpersonal neurobiology. So I think if you can give us a sense of how you use this science-based knowledge of our relational brain to then help us be better parents. And I will also point out that this is Dan's new book. It's also a phenomenal resource, The Power of Showing Up, How Parental Presence Shapes who our children become and how their brains get wired. So this book has a core of focusing on 4 S words. And rather than me trying to explain them, I'm going to hand it to you, Dan. Thank you so much for joining us and for co-hosting this whole webinar series.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, Alyssa. And that was absolutely beautiful, your conversation with Megan. Margot, I'm sorry, Margot. My hippocampus is flooded with names. So can you still hear me okay? Because you have gotten frozen.
Yes.
And you can. Okay. Okay, great. So Margot's town hall meetings sound exquisite. And Margot, I just want to say to you that you're talking about gratitude really when you go deeply into the science of well-being. We can talk about what the science side of that is from a practical point of view, why gratitude would be so important. And just to get to your initial question, Alyssa, that we have this opportunity as medical professionals to draw on science to do our medical work. When I went from my training in medical school to then pediatrics and then psychiatry, I wanted to use the same kind of scientific rigor for the broader field of mental health. So I worked with colleagues to create a field where we combine all the disciplines of science together into one framework. So imagine if you took the wisdom of the hard-earned insights and knowledge from studies such as anthropology for culture or sociology for groups or linguistics, how we speak to each other, psychology with all its myriad aspects of studying emotions and thought and attention, biology, including medicine and the field of neuroscience, chemistry, physics, and even math. Think about combining them all into one framework. So that's what interpersonal neurobiology does. I edit a series of books that mostly other people write, and we have many, many books for clinicians to actually apply this framework to clinical work. And so what I'll do here is just say, for the pandemic and parenting during these, uncertain times, which in journalism, sometimes the acronym, I didn't make this up, but the military actually use this and journalists have built on it. VUCA, V-U-C-A, things are volatile, meaning they change really quickly. U is uncertain, meaning it's hard to predict what's going to happen next. They're volatile, they're uncertain, they're filled with complexity, meaning the system is happening, but it's really hard as a nonlinear system to know when a small thing happens, like someone gets infected in one area of the world, what is going to be the ultimate outcome. So this complex aspect of the world, and A is ambiguous. You can get one piece of information and it has an unclear set of meanings. So these are VUCA times, and here at the Mindsight Institute, what we're trying to do is provide the medically based, scientifically grounded field of interpersonal neurobiology for anyone, in this case we're talking to frontline workers, in the medical field, to see what can you do to build your own resilience. Today, what we're doing is we're focusing on parenting, And so, Alyssa, we can make this a back and forth, but I'll just say this as a starting place. All of the books, I've written 6 parenting books. Each of the 6 books essentially builds on the interpersonal neurobiology scientific framework, which is summarized in a graduate school textbook called The Developing Mind that I now have finished the 3rd edition. And that book is where the science is. Then if you say, well, if I'm a parent listening to this, how can I get the practical applications of that science to understand things like, for example, why Margot finds gratitude so important? So for us, there's a deep process in all of the research that we review for interpersonal neurobiology that says that there is a mechanism beneath resilience and well-being that lets us go from, Alyssa, what you said, from not only surviving, which of course we want to do, but also thriving. And that mechanism, and this is now like hundreds of pages of a 500-page book, can get reduced into one sentence. Integration, which is the honoring of differences and the promoting of linkages. This integrative process, whether it's in your brain, in your head, or the way the brain in your head communicates with the neural systems in your heart and your intestines, or the way the whole body functions, or the way what we would call your inner experience of a self relates to your relational experience of a self. So with gratitude, you find a way of deeply integrating across the inner and the inter, if you will, this way of going beyond just the common experience in modern culture of a separate, isolated, if you will, shrunken solo self. And so gratitude is part of what Dacher Keltner, who's a part of the founder of the Greater Good Science Center, another co-host with UC San Francisco and the Mindsight Institute of this series, what Dacher Keltner has beautifully written about as this historical use of the term self-transcendent emotions, along with this feeling of compassion and awe. And in many ways, those 3 emotions are integrative emotions. And so, Margot, what I think the gratitude does for you is it allows you each day, when you acknowledge, for example, the research shows 3 things you're grateful for at the end of the day, or in Dacher's work, having an experience of awe, which is defined this way. Initially, something feels much larger than you can understand, beyond initial comprehension, and larger than your skin encased body. That's one way of, talking about the specifics of what we mean by awe. So when you go on an awe walk, or even if you feel the awe of how people are being heroes in the medical profession, you as first responders, people are in awe of the dedication that you've had with your life's work. And now in this pandemic situation, caring for all of us as a human family, risking your own well-being, which we can get into in a moment. That feeling of awe, the feeling of gratitude for that, and also compassion, which allows you to go with the important starting place of empathy, feeling the suffering of another, but also moving beyond just resonating with that feeling to imagining what you might do to help others, like people, Margot, offering you to give you meals, a very compassionate act, and then taking action, doing something, even if it's simply bearing witness, doing an action to reduce the suffering of others. So we go from the helplessness we so often feel during the pandemic to being helpful. From the hopelessness, we can emerge into hopefulness when we're being helpful. So that's kind of an overview of the field. We haven't yet gotten into the S's, but let me pause there and make sure we're connected technologically and just start there from the frame of interpersonal neurobiology and the role of integration for both surviving and developing resilience and for thriving.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I want to ask a very basic question. It will give you a chance to talk about the 4 S's. And it's really just about anxiety. A lot of our parents' questions were, I feel anxious. I understand that can transmit or be contagious or rub off on my children. How much is my anxiety related to theirs? What is this relational emotion contagion? And how can I prevent that? And so, we're living in this time where everything is amplified. So children who haven't been anxious are showing new signs of unhappiness or withdrawal and depression. children who already struggle with issues are often getting worse. We've lost the village of support. So now we're talking about a parent and a child and their dyadic interaction. So in this Power of Showing Up, you talk about, you and Tina Payne Bryson talk about 4 critical core components of this way to have a connection with your child that shapes everything. Feeling safe, seen, soothed, and secure. And they're all so important, but I'm only going to give you a few minutes to describe each one. And
Well,
then then we can go back to anxiety.
Yeah. So for everyone listening, you know, as we get into these S's, let's just say that these are absolutely things that the research supports you can do and should do with your children, for sure. But as we go through each of them, they're also something you can do with your partner, if you're sequestered with a partner, or for yourself, your inner experience. So these S's actually apply to any kind of relationship, including the relationship you have with you. So let's dive into it. And let me start with the first aspect of your question, Alyssa, which was, can emotion be, in quotes, contagious? And the reason we're so excited about you know, offering a specific part of this series for first responders on parenting is because it is so important that you as a first responder take care of yourself as best you can when you're in the hospital or in the clinic. And when you go home, to realize that relationships are, in fact, just like Alyssa is suggesting, they are ways where we pass from ourselves the feelings that we have, the emotions, onto others. And now we're talking about children and adolescents. So that is a regular aspect, you know, about emotion. Emotion in many ways is a process that has both inner sensations as well as meaning. So if I have the sensation that these are volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous times, my brain wants to be able to predict things, to feel safe. I don't feel safe, so I'm filled with not only fear, but perhaps even panic and terror. That internal state of what you can call reactivity will be manifest in my whole body. And my child, for sure, no matter what I say, will pick up my bodily state. And we can do a practice in a moment, Alyssa, if you want, to look at the first S, which is safety. So that if you have become filled with a sense of terror, let's say at work, so you come back from the hospital, you wash off, you decontaminate, you're now with your kids, we can teach you in this series a practice that can allow you to go from the reactivity you maybe have been feeling in the hospital, and then certainly in the drive home or the walk home, you may feel that reactivity even more intensely because you're no longer focused on the task at hand of saving people's lives, but now you're in this transition. So the reactivity of terror comes up even more. And what I mean by the reactivity is that the brain has 2 states it can get into, broadly speaking. One is a receptive state of calm and clarity, a sense of safety and security. The other is a state of reactivity, not receptivity. And in this reactivity, there are 4 F's. We learned 2 when we're in medical training, you know, fight and flight, but there's actually 2 others. It's fighting, fighting back, fleeing, running away, freezing, tightening up the muscles and temporarily paralyzing yourself, not knowing whether to fight or flee. And the 4th F, which is rarely talked about, is fainting or feigning death, which is a whole different set of networks in the brain that basically collapse the system when it feels there's nothing that can be done. So hopelessness creates this fainting feeling, which is very different from the energized freeze. You may feel like, oh my God, I don't know what to do. It's a collapse. So those reactive states make it very difficult, if not impossible, to parent well. So the first step to respond to your question, Alyssa, is to learn to soothe yourself, and we'll get into that S soon, by seeing, and we'll get into that S soon, to what's going on with you. Oh, I'm in a reactive state. And then to doing some simple techniques. For example, if the breath feels safe and comfortable, taking a few deep breaths, focusing on the breath, sometimes changing the ratio of the in-breath to the out-breath. Quite simple. So an in-breath, you might do a count of 4. If you feel comfortable with it, you can hold that for a count of 7. So that goes, the in-breath is the sympathetic system of the autonomic nervous system. The holding of the breath activates the parasympathetic brakes. And now you breathe out slowly. Some people like to make a sound with that, like that. And you breathe out slowly for another count of 8. So the ratio of in-breath, the accelerator, to the out-breath, if you do this just 3 times, you'd be amazed how you switch from an activated state to a calmer state as a first step. And then another move you can do besides that is just focus on the breath, just sense the breath in and out. That can be calming as well without changing the ratio. And a third step you can do before you start interacting with the kids is just put, and I'll do this, you put a hand on your chest and a hand on your abdomen. You can try it right now. And just put some gentle pressure. And just see how that feels. Take some nice deep breaths. And now switch it out. So the hand on your chest goes to your abdomen, the one on your abdomen goes to your chest. Put some gentle pressure. Nice deep breath. See how that feels. And now put it whichever way was the most comforting. And in doing this with thousands of people, what we found is that you can have this shift in over 98% of people who do this find it comforting. Over half of those that find it comforting find it's right on top. About a third or a quarter find left on top. We don't know why. Someone can get a study done on that. But the bottom line for you is this can be very comforting for the vast majority of us. So whether it's changing the ratio of breathing, being aware of the sensation of the in-breath and the out-breath, or doing this hand on chest, hand on abdomen, simple move, you have now gotten 3 techniques that will help you when you're coming home to get into this receptive state. So the first S is safety. The kids who are attached to us need to look to us to see what we're feeling. It's called social referencing. They watch our faces, they hear our tone of voice, they look at our posture, all the nonverbal signals that we convey our emotional state. They're going to see, how should I feel in this moment? If we're terrified, they will feel terrified. If we come in with a calm state, even if we're going to talk about a virus that could end your life, amazingly, if you're in a calm state of mind, you can convey information even about things that in other states would be terrifying, that will be received with a state of receptivity. So that's the first S, is safety. And if anything happens that we ourselves are the cause of terror, making a repair of that, because there's no such thing as perfect parenting. If I'm in a bad mood and I start screaming and yelling and my child gets frightened of me, that means you're human. We're living in hard times in general, but this can happen at any time. And so being kind to yourself, realizing you did something that was terrifying to your child, the first S of safety was broken in that moment. You can repair that by beginning again, saying, I'm so sorry. It's been a stressful day. Let's start that again. Tell me how your day was, or however you're going to do that to make a reconnection. So there's no such thing as perfect parenting. Even if you write books on parenting, you always make mess ups. These ruptures that happen, these disconnections that happen can be repaired. And in fact, in the rupture repair process, many researchers feel that's where children learn to become resilient. They realize you're not aiming for perfection, you're aiming for presence, because parental presence is the guide to security, which we can talk about. So that's the first S. And I'll open it up to you, Alyssa, if you want to talk about safety, because this is one of the biggest ones in this time of a pandemic. Did that make sense?
It did, and it was very practical, and it was integrative. You talk a lot about using the sensory world and sensory experience to then integrate our brain away from threat mode so that we are in a relational mind. So I really love that. I think even coming upstairs or downstairs, like when we enter, for those of us sequestered working at home, when we enter a room, rather than being on the phone or carrying in residue of work, taking that breath. And by the way, for me, it's left hand and I'm left-handed. I don't know if that's a clue. But.
I've done a survey and it doesn't appear to be related to handedness, but someone should get a PhD in that.
So let's talk about safety. And I do want to say we're living in a very strange visual world. So, many of us had the experience of waiting in socially distanced lines with masks on. And it's a very isolating experience. So when we walk by someone now, we want to give them space, and the tendency is to not look at them and not connect, when actually we want to be doing the opposite. We want to be smiling and connecting. So for children, seeing the masks, seeing all the cues, and particularly the news, I think my question is, how do we promote this fundamental sense of safety when really safety has been ruptured?
Yeah.
And relatedly, we feel moral distress. We see leaders and bad players who are making things more chaotic and complicated. So we're not all on the same page. And that is very, it's, you know, it really shakes up the ability to feel resilient as a person, as a family, as a community, as a country. So I'm just wondering, how do we, you know, of course it depends on the child's age, but what does safety mean? How can we promote safety for our particularly young children, but even older children who are seeing what's happening on the news?
Yeah, these are such great questions. So I'm going to really try to be as efficient in identifying the really important points you raise, Alyssa, but you've raised so many, we could do a whole seminar just on this one question you've had. So let me just take it step by step. You know, I'm trained by a UC Berkeley professor named Mary Main and her colleague husband, Eric Hesse, in attachment research. So I'm an attachment researcher and an attachment trained scientist. And there's a lot to say about attachment, which is where these 4 S's come from, the science of attachment. So I'm not just making them up out of thin air. They're based on rigorous science over decades by colleagues in this field of attachment research. So let me start step by step. One scientific term that relates to the idea that, and in my daughter who's in graduate school in Columbia, in a course that was just aired online on science and the government and public policy around the coronavirus, it was a really powerful course because it was a violation. It is a violation when people in authority are dismissing science, rejecting science, or even twisting science. It's a violation of what's called epistemic trust. So you may remember from philosophy that you have the how things become, that's called ontology, but you also have the study of how we know what we know, which is called epistemology. So in attachment research, Peter Fonagy has suggested we use, and it's a brilliant idea of his, a researcher from London, the idea that epistemic trust is when you turn to an authority figure and you realize that the way they're conveying the nature of reality is accurate. And so when an attachment figure, mother, father, other caregivers, because we have more than one a caregiver as human beings, called alloparenting, when we have this experience of trust in the nature of how we know about reality, you relax. So the first thing to say is, unfortunately, there is a violation in epistemic trust at the level of the government. And this is a serious, serious problem. Some people would call it moral injury, and you may have talked about this with Roshi Joan Halifax. But this morality about grounding yourself in foundations of reality is huge. So that's the first thing. The next thing is to really build on the work of 2 researchers. You know, one is Jaak Panksepp, and he has several books in our series. And the other is another person who has several books in our series with Norton, the Interpersonal Neurobiology series, Steve Porges. And the bottom line, if we put their 2 beautiful works together, is the brain has for millions of years networks that are constantly watching for danger. I just nickname it the checker. It's distributed. If you do a hand model of the brain like this, where the spinal cord would be in your wrist, the brain stem would be in your hand, palm, the thumb of your hand would be one side of your central limbic areas that are appraising the meaning of things. If you put your fingers on the top, this is your cortex where you do your thinking and reasoning. This whole thing together has a circuit that goes from the brain stem to the limbic area up to the cortex, where it's working together as a whole to link the deep structures usually beneath awareness, this brainstem and limbic area usually beneath our consciousness, and the cortex responds to them. So one of these things it does is it checks, the checker, it's checking for danger. So when you're in line and you see people distancing, even if you say, oh yeah, my cortex tells me, you know, I should be socially distancing 6 feet, wear a mask and all this kind of stuff, your deeper structures are going, I'm doing this because there's a thing I cannot see with my eyes that could kill me or someone I love. And even if you're not consciously aware of that, your checker is doing this thing I call SAM. It's scanning for danger, S. It's alerting you even beneath awareness with a sense of terror and panic and vigilance at a minimum. And then it's going to motivate you. And even if the motivation has to be subdued for now, it's going to motivate you to do things. You can keep your distance. You can get angry at people who aren't keeping their distance. You can make sure a mask is going on. Your kids, when they go out, all these things you can do. Now, the SAM process then is beneath this experience that we have. It's going on even if we're not having it at the top of our way of thinking about things. It has us, and I'll apologize for the ringer. So my alert mechanism is now saying that was supposed to be turned off, but it's not, so I'm apologizing for that. So I then want to calm my checker system and say, you know, it is what it is. I can be alerting to, oh my God, that shouldn't have happened. I was motivated to turn them off. That one didn't get turned off. So I calm myself down. So when you're aware of this checker system, it is actually possible, as you said, name it to tame it, and now this comes to our second S, to see. To be seen is to know the inner subjective life going on in your child or adolescent or in yourself. So here I have to see the ringers going off. A part of me is really anxious and agitated by that. I name it, oh, there's agitation, oh, there's anxiety, that wasn't supposed to happen, maybe I get angry at myself, you know, and now with that alerting process, I can actually alter the motivation. So I can calm myself down from the reactivity that the ringer could have activated to a receptivity. And this is something you can see, it only takes a few seconds. This is how your mind can actually change the processes in your brain. And as your work, Alyssa, has beautifully shown, and your fantastic book with Elizabeth Blackburn called The Telomere Effect, that your presence, this capacity to move from reactivity to the presence of receptivity, actually alters the enzyme telomerase, which repairs and maintains the ends of your chromosomes. It reduces inflammation. It improves your immune system functioning. You know, all these things, including making your heart and your head coordinate in a more balanced way and reducing the stress hormone cortisol. So presence is this capacity to be aware of what's happening as it's happening, let go of judgments, and be there. I use the acronym COAL, to be curious, what's happening, the alarm is going off, to be open, to be accepting, and to be loving. And so this COAL state is exactly what we create when we see ourselves. And it gets to the third S, which we can talk about next, which when you have all three, you build security.
Wow, thank you. That is very wonderful to know the back end, you know, the science of these terms that we know, like attachment. And I do think tomorrow you lead an 1.5-hour session where you're building a, you know, science-based community to over time, where you're going more in depth about the science. So I just want to point people there and point you back to, what do I do now? I have a child at home who is an adult, who is supposed to be in college, who had summer plans, who thought they had a bright future. So a lot of the audience questions were also about, this is devastating to my young adult or to my older teen, because their life is on hold. There's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of moodiness. And so I think the idea of being present and receptive to them and their experience it's clear that that's where we need to start. But just kind of intellectually and schematically, how do we help them through the next few months where they can't really make plans? They can't be with their friends. They're not necessarily, especially for LGBT, you know, students and young adults, they're not necessarily being validated by their community. They might be in stressful situations at home.
Yeah, well, it does bring up the third and fourth S in terms of this specific question. So let's finish that up in addressing this question. The third S is soothed. You know, how does your presence that we've just described actually lead your child, whatever, if they're LGBTQT, if they're struggling with just being isolated, if they're a 15-year-old who want to go dating, if they want to connect with their friends, if they're feeling like, I was going to do this summer and be at camp or have this job, or what's the future like? All of that, no matter what your background is individually, is really distressing. It's not what childhood, quote, was expected to be like. So your role as a parent, and this is going to sound strange, but I'm going to quote a poet who, excuse me. I'm going to quote a poet who has part of their poetry on the entrance to the Brooklyn Public Library. And it goes like this. Having abandoned the flimsy fantasy of certainty, I decided to wander. Now, let's look at what that means. And here, let's just take, can you hear the ambulance going by? So let's take a deep breath. Right now, that may activate in you, listening to this, a sense of agitation. Put a hand on your chest, put a hand on your abdomen. You are learning through what Alyssa Epple has really beautifully been guiding us through all these components of the series, how to turn that ambulance as a stimulus that gets you in an agitated, reactive state of fighting, fleeing, freezing, or fainting. You can bring yourself back to receptivity. So let's just do that. Take a few deep breaths. And if these two activities of hand on chest, hand on abdomen, and the breath sensation in your awareness doesn't work, you can try 4 in, 7 out, or 4 in, 7 hold, 8 out, whichever works for you. You now have at least 3 practical tools to get yourself to receptivity. That's the first thing to say. Now, your child comes to you, says, look, I'm realizing I'm gay and I want to be with my community. You guys don't accept my who I am, and I feel really alienated. Well, the first thing to say is that adolescents need to have connections, relationships, and Brainstorm, that book for adolescents. If they just read it themselves, I wrote it for adolescents, they can see their social connections are a life force. So supporting that through these ways technologically that we can support, instead of using the phrase social distancing, let's use the phrase physical distancing and encourage social connection. It is vital for the mind, especially for an adolescent, that social connection. So soothing may require, number 1, you getting into a receptive state. Number 2, let's talk about that flimsy fantasy of certainty. The mind constructs, whether it's in your individual life with a narrative, family life with a certain set of routines, school life with a plan on going from, the first year of college to the 4th year, and then you go out and do whatever. Everything is about certainty. The brain is considered a prediction machine. It likes to know what's happening next. It likes to plan. We even know which part of the brain does that, and we don't need to get into the brain networks about it, but in being present with the sensation of right now, the sensation of the breath, the sunlight coming through the window, even the sensation of terror. If you can learn to be in that with curiosity, openness, acceptance, and love, this kind regard is what we mean by love, you would be amazed if you looked at the research, which Alyssa has done and I've done, what you do with your mind in opening to what is. So let's talk about the uncertainty of the pandemic. Of course, we had this flimsy fantasy of certainty. So this moment of the pandemic is actually an invitation for us as parents, because I've got, young adult children too. It's an opportunity to sit with uncertainty, which, because of the drive to know what's happening next, makes us nervous. Our checker system says this is dangerous, but actually to learn, this is the soothing part, to feel at ease with uncertainty, to welcome uncertainty, realize that the flimsy fantasy of uncertainty that poet beautifully articulated is actually getting in our way. So when you drop into being present, now we're getting to the security part, your child realizes, wow, there can be a planetary pandemic. My subjective experience is completely thrown around. I'm terrified. I can't plan on anything. And you name it to tame it, right? You connect before you redirect. You say, tell me more about how you're feeling. They tell you, oh, I was planning this, I was planning that. I wanted to be in drama school. You know, I applied to drama. Now, how am I going to do drama online? How's that going to work? I don't know what to do. You go, yeah, this is really, really upsetting. I hear you. So you don't have to solve every emotional dilemma that this pandemic creates, but being present for it is what you are capable of doing if you're receptive. If you yourself are caught up in the flimsy fantasy of certainty, yeah, your child is going to get caught up in it too. And you're off to the races because you're going to both be complaining. Life isn't fair. It shouldn't be like this. This is how life is. Whether you're angry about very understandable things. Let's be really clear. Acceptance does not mean passivity. It means seeing clearly. So whether it's about there not being enough PPE or political issues that you're very aware of that led to this pandemic being more disastrous than it needed to be, or ways that there's disparities in which racial groups are actually dying in this situation, or larger issues related to what are we going to do after the pandemic? How do we find meaning? All of these things are things you can start to work with from a place of presence. And this is why with the 4 S's, safety, right? Being seen, soothed, and then secure, you actually can, and I know this is going to sound strange, but even as there's a threat to survival, you can integrate your life like this and thrive. You really can. And you may think this is just absurd. No, you can't. And what the research shows is that your frame of mind of realizing that something when meaningful is at stake creates stress, your mental state can turn that from a threat state of reactivity to a receptive state of challenge. Mm-hmm. And you go, I don't know the outcome because it's uncertain, but I'm going to be present for this experience.
Wow. This is incredibly relevant to everything we've been talking about. I don't think we'll forget the flimsy fantasy of certainty. And I want to talk about our future now, our uncertain future. This has made the fantasy apparent, which dissipated this delusion that we have that we can control and know our future. So I want to think about, for me, what gives me some solace going forward is we know there's going to be financial hardship for years. This is a very big blip. This is not a quick recovery disaster. And so it's really about the possibilities of how we can emerge from this, living with this uncertain future, how we can emerge better. So I want to read a quote and have you respond to it. The quote is by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who has been very fervently getting messages out to the public in the last few days, particularly yesterday for the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. He's been talking about the importance of water, of protecting healthcare workers with good hygiene, and tying this back to climate, and also the courage of healthcare workers. So let me read you this. This crisis shows that we must all take responsibility. Well, actually, the first view and an important image is really of the Earth. This blue planet is a delightful habitat. Its life is our life, its future our future. And when you see it from far away, there are no boundaries. It is unbounded. We are really living in one group. So in this time of great fear, it's important that we think of the long-term challenges and possibilities of the entire globe. All of us must take care to work to prevent climate change and other destructive forces. This pandemic merely serves as a warning that only by coming together with coordinated global response will we meet the unprecedented magnitude of the future challenges we face. So coming back to our children, of course we want to leave our children with our best attempt at this coming together, at working together, and they will be left with the harder task of what does this look like? True global solidarity to save our Earth, to save ourselves. And so I would like to ask you, because you thought a lot about this, and you're writing a book called MWE, MWE. What changes do we need to make? We all talk about compassion and working together. Where does it start? What mental changes do we need to start to get there?
Yeah. Thank you, Alyssa. You know, this is so powerful, the question. Thank you for quoting His Holiness the Dalai Lama about kindness and compassion and really embracing the reality of interconnection. So one way, and the 10th chapter of this new version of the Developing Mind is all about this one concept that in modern times, modern culture, East and West, I was at a meeting with the Dalai Lama and he actually said, don't just say it's the West, because it's the East and West these days. Modern culture has made our identity of the self be equated either with the brain in your head, myself is up here, or at least within your body. Now that may seem so natural. You may say, of course, that's the way it is. The self is in here. Actually, if you go through a deep scientific analysis, which you'll see in the Developing Mind, the 10th chapter, there is another way of realizing that our identity is both internal, and that we can just call an I or me, and it's relational, which you can call an us or a we. And integration invites us to have both differentiated elements and linked elements. So how would you then integrate identity? Well, you would say you are an internality or an internalness of me, and I'm a relationalness of an interconnectedness of we. And what emerged years ago was this idea of me plus we equals MWE. And the invitation that was arising even just with ecological changes and political issues and racial inequities, but now with the pandemic especially, it's a disorganization of the entire fabric of humanity on Earth to say, at this moment of disorganization, how are we going to reorganize? How are we going to take the meaning of the suffering that's here, the loss of life, the loss of livelihood, and say, do we just say, oh, that was just terrible? Or do we say that was terrible, and there is an opportunity to not go back to business as usual of the same solo shrunken self, but to realize the self is both within a me and a relational self connected to other people and the planet. So that MWE is just an idea. So in the PEP MWE Up talks and gatherings we're doing, it isn't that we're committed to one outcome, but we are saying, let's find meaning in the experience here and now of the pandemic. And then let's try to support the emergence of kindness, of compassion, of gratitude, of awe, of this way of realizing the self is not just in our body, as much as we were raised to believe that. That may have been a false belief. Not only is it a partial truth, it may even be a lethal lie that kills us when we don't collaborate and connect with one another. And the earth, taking a deep breath now, in a way is giving us a meaningful message. Please, please wake up to the reality of interconnection and the integration of our identity. So that's the notion of MWE. And, you know, we have this community that's gathering. I invite everyone to join us because collectively we can have what's called pervasive leadership, which means every individual is capable of deeply embracing the science of development and the science of the mind and the science of what it means to be human, and then bring a meaningful change into the world that we all share.
I was hoping we'd end there. Thank you so much. And I think this, you know, doing this now, all this work immediately, so that as we come out of this, we don't lose these gains. We don't go right back to being so carbon happy, et cetera, it's an amazing opportunity. It's a painful but phenomenal opportunity that we have ahead of us. So thank you, Dan, so much. I'm looking forward to next week where you and I will have a wrap up with everyone after we get to hear Brene Brown. So just a few quick announcements. Our UCSF doctors, as you know, we have flattened the curve here. We are still a high stress, very busy healthcare system, but our doctors and nurses have gone, many of them have gone to New York. They've been at the New York Presbyterian Hospital. Soon we'll hear from Sanjay Reddy, an integrative medicine doc who's going to share his experiences with us. they have also gone to some Native American reservations. So, you know, it's just wonderful, all this kind of shipping of respirators and how New York is feeling at least some relief with all of the influx of volunteers and medical professionals. So on our website, you will see some resources from today. I'm not trying to sell books, but I do want to mention that Dan's wife, Caroline Welch, has just written a phenomenal book. I think of it as a pandemic book called The Gift of Presence, which is really a lot of the science of well-being as well as mindfulness. And lastly, send me a COVID cartoon. Let's start off next week as we dive into some interesting topics about authenticity and being genuine and shame, etc., with Brene Brown. We also want to infuse a lot of humor. Send me your best jokes and cartoons. Thank you so much, everyone. Wonderful to be with you, Dan and Margot, and everyone who sent questions. We so appreciate it. Have a wonderful week.